In episode 7, I built a simple employee directory app. Like a lot of apps in my examples, it's just a one-page app. Real-world apps need multiple pages and shareable links, though. Today, I will take a look at Volt routing. Routing allows us to pass information into a controller and provide shareable URLs to store application state when the page loads. I'll expand upon what we did in episode 7 by adding a second view to the employee directory like you see here. Do you notice that the username is part of the URL? I use that information to store application state and load database records when this page loads. This is all handled by the router and the params object. I've made some updates to the seeds file since episode 7. In episode 7, I created a basic seed file that is used as a runner. If you're unfamiliar with the Faker gem or how runners work, take a look at episode 7. I'm going to run this script before starting. The seed data is going to provide me user records that have a fake name, profile image, URL, and also some phony department names. I'll display all of that information on the individual show page that I showed you in the last scene. The first step to adding a new page is to modify the routes file. There are a couple things going on in this one line. The first part is that we're defining a model inside of the params variable. By adding a username to the URL path, we're able to access it inside of a controller like this. Just like any other collection object, we can access URL params using underscore notation. That's useful since we'll need to access this information when we write the controller code. After the URL path, you can pass in options to tell Volt which component, controller, and action to render when it hits that URL. If you don't provide a component or controller name when you add a client route, Volt assumes that you're using the main controller and main component. These default settings are actually not a hard rule, but rather a convention. If you have a different idea about how Volt should resolve routes, you can change the behavior. I'll cover advanced routing behavior in part 2 next week. New Volt apps come with examples of default routing behavior also. Take a look at the routes for the user templates gem that comes with every new Volt app. As you see, it follows this convention. It's referencing components and controllers that live inside of a gem. There's one last mistake that a lot of beginners make that I'd like to talk about. When you add a new route to your app, make sure you leave the root path as the last route. That's because routes are evaluated from top to bottom. Forgetting to put the default route at the bottom of the route file can cause some unexpected behavior. As long as the main route is defined last, you won't hit any issues though. Another common pitfall is using underscore notations in routes. You don't need to use underscore notation when you define param variables in a route file. You do need to use underscore notation when you access them, though. Here's the index.html file I set up for the example. It's that list of employees I showed you in the beginning. It should look pretty familiar to you if you've already watched episode 7. There is one change to point out, though. This attribute binding will interpolate the username into the URL and thereby trigger a route to be calculated. In many ways, it's no different than any other HTML link tag, aside from the data interpolation. Now we can paste in the code for the show action. This one is even more simple. It's just a layout that displays individual user information. Did you notice that I'm calling the model attributes directly? I didn't need to store the user model in the page store or anything like that. I achieved that by setting the model attribute on the controller. Let's write the controller code that will support this view. Since this is the show action, I'll write a corresponding show method on the controller. Then I'll set the controller's model attribute. Let's review this line from left to right. The first thing I'm doing is setting the controller's model attribute. The right side of the assignment is returning a promise object. If you assign a controller's model to a promise, it will wait until the promise resolves before it renders the view. If we did this some other way, such as assigning it to a page store immediately, we might end up with nil exceptions in the view. That's because the view would try to render the model before it arrives from the backend. We can get around this by setting the model property on the controller like we just did. Now what about the query on the right-hand side of the assignment? Take a look at the call I make to the params object. Since we defined the route to have a username attribute, we're allowed to access it right here. We could have also put in any number of query string parameters also. Conversely, if we were to change the value of the username, the URL would automatically update because it's a two-way data binding. Now let's test it out in the browser. Looks like we don't have any errors here, and there we go. When I click a user, it loads everything from the params like it's supposed to. At this point, we've covered enough about routing to cover most use cases, so let's take a look at one last thing before we finish up. If you've been working on Volt apps before, maybe you've seen this method inside of your controller and you've wondered what it does. Remember in the routes file when I said that the params object followed a convention for resolving routes? Remember how we could pass the route an attribute like controller or action? This is where that information gets utilized. The main path method that you see here is responsible for enforcing the standard routing behavior in Volt. It's just a convention though, and you're free to modify the way routes are resolved if you understand how templating and routes relate to each other. This makes Volt very unique from other MVC frameworks. The router is loosely coupled to other parts of the app, and you're free to change the way it behaves. This is more than we have time for in today's episode, so stay tuned for part 2, where I take a deep dive into routes and templates. If you liked the episode and want to support future Volt screencasts, consider subscribing to DataMelon Premium. You'll get access to premium content not found on the YouTube channel, plus easy access to all episodes in one place. I hope you'll try it out. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.